you can't just help schools without actually addressing the kind of cultural DNA, the community involvement. And so
Yes.
what is your sense of the connection between change and community involvement?
Well, let's go back to what you started with. And when you were referring to the guest that's going to be at the conference who takes a different point of view and he says we have to start with what? For a very long time, I believed we have to start with what? What do we want these kids to know and be able to do? What do we want to have as the end product of this system? It was when I began to see school districts, superintendents, smart school board members, engaged teachers, aggressively begin to sort out and define the what, and then begin to make concrete steps towards changing a system that would produce the newly defined what. And they went forward, and they brought in consultants, and they read the literature, and they sat around after hours at tables laden with caffeine and carbohydrates, and they argued and they processed, and then they went to conferences and brought back more. And after about 15 to 18 months of all this really smart, very hard work, most of it on their own time, the only thing that changed in those school districts, it wasn't assessment, it wasn't the curriculum, it wasn't instruction. The only thing that changed was the superintendent. Well, watch that happen to good people, not once, dozens and dozens of times. And even I, who readily admit I'm a tad slow on the uptake, even I began to think, we're missing a step. And it's there, right then, at that moment, when I begin to move a step backwards. As much as that irritated the A-type personality that I carry, I had to take a step backwards and say, yeah, maybe before we get to what, we have a legal and fiduciary, and I would argue moral responsibility to effectively identify that what, and then lay out a process so that all children are prepared in a way that we think makes sense. But it does us no good if every single 2 years there's a complete change in leadership and everything is ripped back to the status quo ante. There's the connection between making the change and the culture of the town. Because, you didn't refer to it directly, but my #1 rule is you cannot touch a school without touching the culture of the town. And if you follow that, if all the people listening follow that to its logical conclusion, what that means is, if we really are going to increase student success, broadly defined, we have to do more than change our schools. We have to change America. And that's why it's so damn hard.
So there's this, you have several quotes in the book. We're going to get to the really sort of shocking one from Jefferson, one I was not aware of, but and shouldn't have been shocked by, but is a very good one. But there's this thread through the book of the power of democracy. You've got quotes from de Tocqueville and from Jefferson and I think Adams, and I felt like there's a little bit of a tension here because the description you give for the Great Conversation is in fact a little bit one-sided.
Yes.
The Q&A piece is very short at the end, and I wondered, have you reflected on that afterwards and thought any more about maybe having the sort of the democratic roots that appear in the book be more a part of that process?
Yes, I did. I have. I do all the time. A phrase that I have thought of many times in this context is, a conversation is not a monologue in the presence of witnesses. And so let's go back one little piece, because you were kind in your words regarding my own transformation in this intellectual process. But two things happened the day of the Blueberry story. Two things happened in the story I described where I go actually into a school and be a teacher's aide for a day. But let's just take symbolically the Blueberry Lady, as she's now called. She could have gone back to her room and said nothing. She could have cursed my skinny butt all the way down that hallway, getting ready for those kids to show up after lunch. Steve, she stood up. She stood up and she was armed with the one thing. You talk about a shallow conversation. She was armed with the one thing that every single person working inside a public school in America has today. She was armed with the truth. And I stood on the stage, all suited up, representing the business and political establishment of the entire state. I loomed over her on this stage. She's down there in the audience. She stood up and she spoke the truth. It takes both of those things. Now you add the piece that you mentioned, which I readily admit is a little thin in the book. But then other people have to listen and then respond. So that if I say that I don't want to use the word retreat, I have correctly identified the starting point in the conversation preceding the what question. Well, it turns out that in this democracy, someone has said, Jamie, it sounds like you're promoting democracy. I don't think it's working anymore. My response is, I don't think we're trying it, which references your shallow conversation. But I start from the idea, and this is why the richness of the conversation is lacking, and I readily admit it. I start from the idea that we have to begin the conversation by front-end loading our success story, because there's so much viral negativity, Steve, that the public, the vast majority of which no longer have children in school. The public is steeped in this negativity soup so that you can't get them even to listen without them having say, oh, you're just being an apologist, or you're just trying, if you were a teacher or an administrator, oh, you're just trying to feather your own nest. I start from the point we have to begin the conversation by front-end loading stories of our success, just to get them to begin to listen. I assume at some point you're going to refer to the long list of things that I have put in the book about what's been added to school. Somehow or another, in order to get to that authentic democratic dialogue, we've got to get people to say, huh, I never thought about that before. Because now they're all locked in this mental model that is more likely created by critics on talk radio than it is by the woman in the Blueberry story who really knows what the starting point is.